good to see we've got the technology sorted out. Delighted to be here this morning. I think like yourselves, I thoroughly enjoyed Mark's talk this morning. Did you hear what he said? I captured it and I didn't actually tweet it, but I captured it to tweet later. At one point he said something like this: we didn't talk to each other, we didn't listen to each other, and that's why we failed. And I thought that was a rather sort of interesting introduction in some way to this talk of mine this morning on conversational leadership. Now, how many of you got any idea who this is, where this is, when it was? Anybody seen this at all? It's Henry of Germany giving a lecture at the University of Bologna in about 1340. I think what's quite remarkable about this little painting is that the lecture hasn't really changed a great deal in 600 or 700 years. Just take a look at it a little closer. Do I have that? I do. This gentleman's asleep. He's asleep. They're quite bright and bushy-tailed in the front row. I don't see anybody asleep at the back. But look even more closer, the conversation going on here, I think he's trying to make out with the lady next to him. But can you spot something in there that's a little unusual? If you look carefully, maybe towards the back row. What do you think he's doing? I'm absolutely convinced he's texting on his mobile. So things really have not changed in 600 or 700 years. So my rhetorical question for you, have you ever questioned the lecture? What I'm doing now, to be honest, as an effective means of communication, as an effective means of learning. This gentleman is a lecturer at the University of Surrey, Donald Clark, and he says, show me a professor of education who still lectures, and I'll show you a hypocrite who hasn't read the research. I think that's probably a little bit harsh, but at the same time, the bulk of the research shows that a lecture isn't a terribly good way of learning. And I guess I started to question it in my own way almost 15 years ago. I started to run some things called knowledge cafes in London. I know one or two of you. How many of you actually been to one or two of the knowledge cafes? I know. 1, 2. Okay. They're free events, so you're more than welcome to come along. But back about the year 2000, I used to go along to some talks, some knowledge management talks that were given in the evening, organised by some alumni at what was then the City University Business School. It's now Cass Business School. And the talks lasted, I guess, about an hour maybe. And in true British tradition, we'd go down the pub afterwards. And many of those talks were good, but I think actually more than 50% of them were dire. They were literally death by PowerPoint. They were literally sleep-inducing. And when the speakers were talking about knowledge management, they were talking about knowledge, they were talking about learning, they were talking about engagement. It just seemed that we weren't walking the talk. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to do something more conversational. Because on evenings like that... What do you think was the best part of the evening? The pub, yes. And it wasn't so much the alcohol, it was more that I felt that was where the real engagement with the topic of the evening was taking place. That's where people were having conversations about what the speaker had to say and sort of developing their own paths and sharing their own experiences and their own insights. I thought that was where the real learning was taking place. So I wanted to create something where I ran events in London and maybe the speaker only got to speak for 5 minutes and then the rest of the evening was turned over to conversation. And I say, that's what I started to do in London almost 15 years ago now. Now this was just a sideline at the time, but they've taken over my life. I've ended up running knowledge cafes in London, probably 6 or 7 of them every year for the last 10, 15 years. But I've also ended up running them pretty much all over the world in many, many different cultures. I learned a lot about people, a lot about culture, a lot about conversation. And I really discovered that I think fundamentally people love to talk. If you can take away the barriers, if you can take away a lot of the fear of people speaking up, and I found it especially so in Asian cultures, where there does tend to be a very strong sort of deference to authority. If you can take away some of that fear and allow people to just freely engage in conversation, then it's what we enjoy doing, and it's how we learn. And I haven't quite coloured the world red, but I've been doing quite a good job these last few years. So I've been running these cafes. What's happened there? Okay. What did I do there? Sorry, just bear with me. Okay, right. Okay. The essence of the cafe is about bringing a small group of people together to have a conversation around a topic of mutual interest. I mean, that's the essence. I've learned over the years that there's a little bit more to the cafes than that, and I'm going to share some of that experience with you. So it's about learning from each other, basically recognizing that different people have got different perspectives. When somebody disagrees with you, it's not really an opportunity for an argument or a debate, which is what we tend to do. It's actually an opportunity, to learn. Why does this person see the world differently to ourselves? And of course, if you think about our multicultural world today, people with different education, different background, different ages, different religions, it's not too surprising that we see the world differently. And I just included this little video clip of a cafe I ran in London a few years ago now, and I deliberately put the sound down. I'm just trying to give you an idea, although you kind of already know it, of just the energy that you get in a conversation. When you in a really good conversation, you put your whole body into the interaction. You look here, and you just look at the body language of the people as they're engaging in the conversation. I think if you forced people to sit on their hands, they wouldn't have such a good conversation. Now, I don't want to go into the cafe process in detail, but it's just worth me just explaining the process. And it's a very, very simple process. First of all, the host explains a little bit about the cafe, about the process. It's usually triggered by a speaker who would speak for maybe only as little as 5 minutes, maybe at the most 15 or 20 minutes, but really no more than that, to set the context, the theme for the conversation. And then the key thing is that that speaker poses a question, an open-ended question, maybe a somewhat provocative question to the group to trigger the conversation. Now, what I've learned over the years is that the best way to seat people is in 3s or 4s, really no more than that, at small round tables. So this is almost an ideal table size and an ideal situation. Once you go over 4 or 5 people, it becomes less of a conversation and more of a series of monologues. 3 or 4, maybe 5 is the best size for a conversation. So I have people sitting at small round tables like that, maybe up to about 30 people. They have a conversation around the topic for maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes. Then I ask them to change tables. And so we have 3 rounds of small group conversation. And yes, we just have those 3 rounds of small group conversation. Then what I do is I bring them back together, typically in a circle like this. So it works better when there's a smaller group of people because it's more intimate. And then we continue that conversation in the circle. And eventually, if I've got time, I'll go around the circle and ask each person just to share one thing that they've learnt from the conversation. Because really the key thing about the cafe is that the outcome of the cafe is very much what people take away in their heads, which is very much what's happening here with this talk. The outcome of this morning will be what you take away in your heads. It won't be some project plan or some agreement. It's fundamentally about learning. And a good cafe maybe takes about 2 hours in total. Okay? Now I've got a few principles. I was talking earlier about sort of driving out some of the fear behind the cafe. The first is I'm looking for sort of dialogue rather than debate. So looking for people to listen to each other and engage with each other, not look to defeat each other in some sort of debate. So that everyone's equal. So I don't want table leaders or table hosts or one person that's going to stand up and report back. I'm trying to create a similar sort of environment to the pub where there is nobody in charge, nobody in control. Occasionally I get somebody who calls me or emails me and says, David, I'm really a little bit shy. Can I come along to your cafe and just listen? I don't want to actually talk. And they come along and usually they end up engaging. It's very difficult in a small group when there's 3 or 4 people not to engage in the conversation. But I say it's okay to just listen. Surprisingly, I also say it's okay to go off topic. In any good conversation, you always go off topic, don't you? You usually come back at some point or another. So I say it's okay to go off topic. And again, it's not about reaching consensus. The cafe is all about learning. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about that cafe process. Now, as I've run these cafes around the world and got involved in all the various things that I've got involved in, I've come to see that conversation is almost the lifeblood of an organization. All those little conversations that we have every day, in our everyday working lives, and just start to appreciate just how important that conversation is. And I'm really not the only one to kind of recognize that. I mean, in some ways it's nothing new. Some of you might be familiar with the book, The Clue Train Manifesto, from about the turn of the millennium. And in that book, David Weinberger said that as knowledge workers, that was our job, to have interesting conversations. He didn't say productive conversations or effective conversations. He said, interesting conversations. That was our work today as knowledge workers. And Alan Weber in the Harvard Business Review, in the new economy, conversations are the most important form of work. And I think that when the problem is with conversation, we tend to take it for granted because we've never been taught how to have a conversation. We've just grown up in this sort of world of conversation, and I think at times we just totally overlook its importance, its centrality, and its power. So I come to believe that conversation is probably the most powerful business tool that we have, the most powerful project management tool that we have. I think it's the most powerful tool that we have to do anything in our lives, whether it's at a business level, a personal level, or a societal level. That's talking to each other, building relationships, getting to know each other is the core, if you will, of what it is to be human. So over those years, those last 10, 15 years, I've come to get interested in something that people are calling conversational leadership. And this is my sort of simple definition, just not put a definition on this. And I'm saying that conversational leadership is a style of working where we recognize this power of conversation and we start to take a conversational approach to the way that we work. And it's that I want to share with you for the rest of this session. So I talk about conversational leadership and I talk about conversational leaders. So I use that word leader, but I'm not thinking in terms of a senior manager or an appointed leader. I quite like this definition from Daniel Goleman. Again, I think Mark hinted at it as well when he talked about leadership. He talked about influence, that we've all got influence and we can all choose to use that influence, and as such, that makes us a leader. So when I talk about conversational leadership, I'm talking about it for everybody, not just for the so-called appointed leaders. And I think there's sort of 3 or 4 elements to what constitutes conversational leadership. I think a big part of it is baking conversation into everything that we do. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. Another part of it is stopping and reflecting on our own personal conversational style, our conversational habits. Some of us talk far too much, don't listen enough, and I think we tend to know when we're doing that, but we tend not to change. And a lot of us are actually quite quiet and need to learn to speak up. I often wonder why I've got interested in conversation. When I was, I guess, between the ages of 13 and 18, I was an incredibly shy, nervous teenager. I had a stutter, and if I'd known sort of 50-odd years later I'd be standing in front of a room giving a talk, I wouldn't have believed it. At the time, I would rather have died than do something like this. So I think, again, a lot of this is about personal habits. It's about thinking about the way that we interact with each other. And then finally, and I think the more powerful part of what conversational leadership is about, is recognizing that we've all got the potential to be what I call and other people call conversational architects, that we recognize the important questions that need to be asked, either within our projects or within our organization, and that we actually design, convene, and host those conversations to better understand different issues, to ultimately make better decisions. So I just want to take you through a few of these. This is interesting, talking about conversational habits, and just focus on two things about talking more and listening more, just very briefly. If you want to be a conversational leader, one thing to do is to start having more conversations. And this can be about getting away from your PC and getting out and talking to people. Maybe about having lunch with people rather than having a sandwich at your desk. And I think the interesting thing about this, and it seems a rather strange thing to say, that it's not too important what you talk about. Now, the reason I say this is based on some research by this gentleman, Alex Pentland, at the Human Dynamics Lab at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He says, from his research, that the most important predictor of success in a group or a team is the amount of social interaction, regardless of what people actually talk about. He's wired people up with these little sociometric badges, as he calls them, that will monitor where they are in the building, who's in proximity to them, and the conversation that they're having. Sounds a little bit intrusive. I'm not too sure he's demonstrated sort of cause and effect, but he's certainly demonstrated correlation. He's looked at lots of teams, successful and not so successful teams, and the more successful teams, really not too surprisingly, interact more socially. So get out and talk about the sport, talk about the weather, if that's what works for you. So interesting thought. And then Nancy Klein, lady you may have come across in the book she wrote a few years ago called Time to Think, she makes the point that listening is not a passive act, it's a very powerful action. And what she says in the book is that if we take the time to listen to somebody, and Stephen Covey talks about it in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he says we need to listen to understand rather than listen with the intent to reply. But what she says, she goes a step further, that if we take the time to stop and listen to another person, and then we genuinely listen and not interrupt them or try to give them advice, just listen and just draw them out. What she thinks, and I tend to agree with her, is that we help that person with their thinking. That as they articulate sort of half-baked ideas in their head, they start to piece together those ideas and they start to have insights and thoughts that they wouldn't have had, just sitting in an armchair or in the shower. That act of listening is a very powerful creative act. So, interesting thought. Now, I'm not going to talk all about these. The other thing we can do if we take on this role of conversational leader, is take the time to better understand the dozens of conversational tools and methods that we have available to us. Some of these you'll recognize, I'm sure, like peer assist and post-project reviews, after-action reviews, storytelling. These are all face-to-face conversational methods that we can utilize to start to bake conversation into everything that we do. And clearly, I feel the Knowledge Cafe is one of those methods. And again, think about conversation after think about it as a Swiss Army knife, if you will. There's so many different purposes that it can be put to, and I've just listed some of the more obvious ones here that you could add to that list. But let me just share with you maybe three, I think, different ways I've seen organizations effectively use conversation as a tool. This first story goes back to maybe a year or so after I ran my first public knowledge cafe in London. And what I often used to do with KMers, the question I would pose would be, what are the barriers to knowledge sharing in your organization, and how might you overcome them? This was the first time I'd actually run a knowledge cafe inside an organization. So I said to them, what are the barriers to knowledge sharing in your organization, and how do you think you could overcome them? And we just got into the first round of conversation, and one of the women managers stood up and said, David, stop, we've got to stop. And I thought something had gone terribly wrong. She said, no, we've got to capture things, because normally, in the cafe, I wouldn't be trying to capture things on a flip chart. And they were discovering all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems that they weren't aware of. And what I hadn't realized before the cafe was that there were 3 different departments in the room. This was only an organization of about 80 people. So you'd think they would talk to each other. There were 3 separate departments in the room, and this was the first time they'd ever sat down and just had, it was like a casual conversation with each other. And again, about issues in the organization. And all sorts of things were being surfaced. And so she actually stepped out of the circle, if you will, and captured all these issues to follow up on. And that was where, for the first time, I realized that maybe the cafe was more powerful than a simple replacement for a death by PowerPoint presentation. And the manager who invited me a month or so later in an email to me said these were the sorts of things that the cafe had done for his organization, which in some ways at the time really pleased me, but also surprised me. That there'd been an improvement in collaboration, that many of the internal work processes had been overhauled as a result, because a lot of those processes weren't working because they had just evolved and nobody had stopped to take the time to ask or have a conversation around whether they were working or not. And last but not least here, that it had actually empowered the people in the organization to actually speak up and feel they have a voice, which another impact of that conversation. So again, something that's very easy to do in an organization is to use methods like the cafe to break down organizational silos. And this is a very, very simple one. Often when we want feedback from people, what do? We create a survey form, or we go out and do one-on-one interviews. What the NCR do in Hong Kong, they have conversations with their commuters. This is a coffee booth on one of the stations where they invite commuters in to have a free coffee and have a conversation with them and other commuters about their quality of service. And they even have special coffee carriages on some of the commuter trains where you can go, have a free coffee and have a conversation and give feedback. Kind of indirectly, because what they're doing is listening into the conversations. I think often when somebody asks you a question, David, are you happy with the quality of the service? You sort of think for a minute and say, well, yeah, I think so. But then when somebody else says, well, no, the other day there was a problem with litter on the train, And then you go, oh yes, I remember a similar circumstance. And it's other people's conversation and other people's experiences trigger your own memory. And then things start to flow and surface that normally wouldn't actually come out. So this might seem like a very simple example, but at the same time I think it's a very powerful one. And another, in some ways quite simple example, how many of you have been in a meeting where the meeting is to make a decision and there are like two factions in the room, two groups of people in the room? There's one faction, they tend to usually be the senior managers, or they tend to be the more outspoken people. They've already made up their mind what the decision is. And as far as they're concerned, the purpose of the meeting is to force everybody into compliance, to agree with them. And so they're very in your face, they're very argumentative, they see everything as a debate, they don't want to discuss things, they just want to convince everybody this is the right decision. And then there's the other faction who are not so sure. They're not so sure that the issue's been fully understood. They want to discuss things more openly and explore other opportunities. And those two groups end up having a big bun fight. And it's usually the dominant people that tend to win. But at the end of the day, everybody goes away not feeling terribly happy. And it's usually the dominant people that have won. So the other people feel they haven't been heard and they're not really bought into the decision. I mean, going back to my corporate life, I can remember several situations like that. But it needn't be like that. I guess it's always going to be a little like that because you can't get away from sort of company politics. But split that meeting into two. Make the first meeting more cafe-like. Say this first meeting is not about making a decision, it's about exploring the issue. And we're free to discuss anything about this issue that we want to. Then maybe have the second half of the meeting, maybe a week later, to give time for people to reflect and have their own conversations over coffee or lunch. And in that second meeting say, okay, now we've done the exploration, we've got to make a decision. Now let's get into that decision-making process. And that can be more political, that can be more combative. But at least you've taken the time to explore the issue. And if nothing else, the people who are a little uneasy about maybe the decision feel that their voice has been heard. I know myself in organizational life, I never had a problem with a senior manager, my boss or whatever, making a decision that I didn't agree with, as long as I felt that he or she had listened to me. And then, I could buy into it. But when I felt that my thoughts, my feelings, the respect for me had been overridden, then I was really never ever brought in. So again, a very simple way of baking conversation into the organization. And I think this is the last one I've got here, and this one's my favorite, and I'm really annoyed that I never came up with this idea. It was something invented by Nesta, which is an innovation charity here in the UK, and it's such a simple idea. Let me put up with the title of Randomized Copy Trials. Basically what they say, they set up a little system where they say, we will pair two people at random, once a week or once a month, just pair two people in the organization at random, regardless of hierarchy or level, and give you 30 minutes to have a conversation over coffee during that month about anything that you want. So it's sort of like a serendipitous sort of conversation. You don't quite know who you're going to be matched with. You don't quite know where the conversation is going to go. It could end up being, I know, a waste of time maybe. You have a conversation with somebody you don't really get on with. On the other hand, some serendipity can come from it. And you can learn something interesting, you can make a new friend, whatever. It's such a simple tool. Paul mentioned my community of 22,000 people. It's probably a couple of thousand in London. And I have, I think, about 100, maybe a few more, of them signed up to a similar system. And once a month, they get a little email where they're matched with somebody else in London. And they can either choose to have a coffee face-to-face, or if they can't make it face-to-face, they can do it via Skype. And you can see here there are quite a few organisations that have caught on to it. And the Red Cross, Red Crescent, for example, they've got several 100,000 volunteers worldwide, and they sign them up for a virtual coffee once a month. They actually make sure that the person you're signed up with is in another country. So I might be a volunteer working in Australia, and I'm signed up with a volunteer working in South America, in Bolivia, and they have a virtual coffee over Skype and share their thoughts and experiences and motivations in working for the Red Cross. So they're trying to kind of create some sort of social fabric in what's sort of otherwise a networked organisation. So yes, randomised coffee trials, just love the idea. If you're interested in doing that, I can put you in touch with an organisation. In fact, the guy who invented it, a guy called Michael Soto, he left Leicester and set up his own little company, a little software service company that will do the matching for you. And if you're a small organisation doing that matching, you can always put the names in a hat. If you're a larger organisation, you need some software to do it. And he's created a company called Spark Collaboration to do that for you. And the very last sort of elements of conversation leadership is what I mentioned earlier, and that was what I call sort of strategic conversations, people going out and actually designing and convening the conversations that they felt were necessarily in an organisation. I think the issue here really is that as the world gets more and more complex and more fast-paced, no one person can understand it, and no one person on their own, especially a manager, who's maybe away from the sort of the coalface of things, is in a good position to make an informed decision. So the idea of a powerful conversation or strategic conversation is to bring a small, diverse group of people together in some sort of structured conversation, maybe a little bit like a cafe, to make sense of an issue, whether it's a risk, whether it's an opportunity, to have a conversation around it, to better understand it in order to ultimately make a better decision. As I say, think of them as conversational architects, if you will. And of course, this works best very much with complex issues, and those are usually they're usually the people issues. And if you're looking to maybe change the culture in your organisation, or looking to change people's behaviours in some way, getting people to engage with that, getting them to talk about it, makes a huge amount of sense, because there's just this huge diversity of opinion as to the way things should work. So, just drawing to an end, just a few words on getting started. If in any way I've sort of inspired you to go back to your organisations and talk a little more. Very simple, really. When you do go back, just start to talk with people on your team, in the organisation, about the issues that matter. Stop and think, who should you be talking with? In particular, what are the questions, what are the challenges, what are the issues for the organisation or for the project or for the team? What are the big issues? And get them to talk about it. Get together and talk about it. Come back to what Mark said this morning. His problem with his early style of communication was about talking at people and telling them, you will be motivated, Paul, rather than saying, let's sit down and figure out how we can better work together and how we can support each other. So and in some ways that's kind of at the heart of what this is about. I think too often we're trying to do things to each other, we're trying to motivate each other, we're trying to reward people, we're trying to punish people, when what we really should be doing is having conversations and figuring out how we can better work together. Now, I'm not the only one talking about this thing called conversational leadership. If you're interested, either see me or I'm sure you get a copy of the slides. There are a lot of interesting books and a lot of interesting people talking about the same sort of thing, and coming from somewhat different angles to me, but at the heart of it, they're talking about getting more conversation into an organisation. Now, I think I'm pretty much on time. I think I've got 10 more minutes thereabouts, Paul. Yeah?
We need to keep it fairly tight, just in case anybody wants to
Okay,
change.
let's keep it tight.
Finish in 3.
What I want to do is just ask you to turn to each other. I'm just going to give you a minute and have a conversation around my talk. But in particular, you know, what actual insights have you got from my talk? If you think you're going to go away and do something just a little bit different, just share that with your neighbour. If you think that I haven't impressed you at all, and you know you're just going to go back and work the way you normally have, then fine, share that as well. But let's just have a minute's conversation, at the very least, and then I'll take a few questions, and we'll keep the time. So, thank you for